What's going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I'm joined with my friend
Brandon. We are strapping up some belts today.
We are in Basement Brandon's home gym right now. We're talking belts, and today in this video, we're gonna be breaking down lever belts versus prong belts versus Velcro belts, talk about the benefits of each, why you would use each, and kind of when you wouldn't want to use each. But that said, let's dive into our first type of belt.
Let's get into it.
So the first belt we're gonna cover is the Velcro belt. This is what we both kind of agreed on, that this is probably the most common type of belt you'll see at your local recreational commercial gym or whatever. And this is likely the first belt that you've bought as a lifter if you've ever bought a belt, which is like a good old like $30 or $40 Amazon buy, which is what I did for my first belt as well.
Yeah, the belt world can be very daunting, like other things like shoes or any high-end piece of gym equipment. So when most people buy that, they tend to make just whatever is the most cost efficient and looks the best in some cases, and this belt usually fit that kind of trend where you don't have to be super specific about sizing because the Velcro is there, and it can be used for multiple different exercises, not just one specialty type of lifting.
And now with Velcro belts, a couple of construction features that you can expect with them is obviously number one, you're going to have Velcro as your main means of tightening the belt. You'll also generally have a metal buckle. If you ever buy a Velcro belt that has a plastic buckle, I would say probably run from that because that thing has a short lifespan and you obviously don't want that blowing off mid-lift, which I've had happen on a couple of belts, not necessarily plastic belts, but it's not a good feeling nonetheless. What else would you say is a good construction call out for a Velcro belt?
Yeah, so I mean, with Velcro belts, you typically won't have the same level of thickness as some of the leather belts we're gonna take a look at, but you still want something that's going to offer you some level of support, right? So that's what this does. Now, a lot of times with using belts, people get the misconception that they have to wear something as tight as possible, when in reality, the purpose of a belt is to help add to stability and give you something to brace against.
Yeah, it's the proprioceptive cues that a belt brings that I think a lot of people overlook. Now, with Velcro belts specifically, when and why would you want to use them? So my first case comes to cross training, right? Like CrossFit, functional fitness workouts, basically workouts that are a little bit more mixed modality where I'm gonna be cleaning, I might be doing some form of sandbag throw, and I do want a little bit of extra support. That's the first context in which a Velcro belt I think works really well.
Yeah, for me, who's someone predominantly trains for powerlifting specifically, you'll see some other belts that we'll talk about from prongs to levers and whatnot, yet I still own a Velcro belt, which I bought after the fact. And the reason I bought this is for someone like me, I still like to do some other types of training like Jake mentioned. For me specifically, things like log presses. So in order to clean this up, I actually like the minimalist features of this where you're not dealing with a big heavy buckle in the front that could potentially get in the way, could get damaged or damage the equipment you're using. This offers some support while still being a very minimal footprint.
And the reason why you don't necessarily always want like a lever belt or something that's more thick for that style of training is when you're going into that deep torso flexion. I don't know if you've all ever have flexed into that kind of belt, but it is not a comfortable feeling. And so if you're gonna be doing more flexion or more cross functionality stuff, I would also argue that this can be a great belt for just general commercial gym use. So if you're just a recreational lifter going to do some general strength stuff and you don't want anything too crazy or over the top or to drop a ton of money, this can be a great option to look into. And like also, would you say that this is a good belt for beginners looking to get into like learning how to use a belt, because it's very easy, very low cost, and it can kind of like give you that nice runway as to, okay, like how do I physically brace into a belt without having anything too rigid to kind of throw you off?
Yeah, I think to your point exactly. You could literally grow into this belt, number one, from your lifting career and just getting used to using a belt and bracing and not having a very high cost of entry, but also the fact that it's Velcro allows for a wide variety of sizes. Typically when you buy a powerlifting or a leather style belt, there's a finite amount of adjusting you can do. With the Velcro aspect here, you have a lot more range of motion in that case.
And now before we wrap up this section, when would you not want to use a Velcro belt? Now obviously that's a very nuanced question here, and that obviously involves a bigger discussion, but I would argue that if you're like a competitive power lifter or somebody who wants the most amount of stability possible with your belt, that would likely be a scenario in which you might want to pass on a Velcro belt. Do you have any other context where a Velcro belt might fall short?
No, and I think that's where I would say is too. If you're looking to get the most out of your strength training and be as strong as possible, this belt, while it's sufficient under heavier loads, I would much prefer something that's number one, more secure in terms of the latching system, but also number two, in the thickness and the level of support it provides.
Gotcha, and now let's dive in to a belt that's a little bit more specific. Our next belt is a lever belt. Now, with a lever belt, obviously the biggest call out is the lever. Now with lever belts, Brandon, what are some construction features that you can expect to have with this type of belt?
Yeah, so the main reason people would go with a lever belt is because it allows you to get the same consistent fit over and over again. We've already taken a look at a Velcro belt. In a minute, we'll take a look at a Prong belt. But those are what I would consider more traditional belt latch systems, meaning you have to pull it to a certain tightness. With a lever belt, it's set at a specific tightness, and the lever allows you some adjustability where you get that good angle and you can cinch it to the tightness that you want, time in, time out. And also, probably more importantly, if you've ever put on a very tight weightlifting belt and tried to get it off, it allows you for easy out, which is great when you finished a tough set.
Yeah, nothing is worse than being absolutely gassed after a squat set and then trying to adjust your
We've all been there.
It is not a great feeling. But outside of the actual lever of these belts, and we'll talk about the nuance between these two types of levers, you can also expect a thicker material with the style of belt. So generally you're gonna have a thickness of what, like 10 to 13 millimeters for the leather?
Yeah, so for the most part, the most general use cases you'll see is 10 or 13. Now there is stuff that goes a little bit beneath that. You'll see some 6 and 8 millimeters, and it's usually the same actual insides being the harder, stiffer leather, but maybe perhaps with a reduction of the outside layer itself. 10 to 13 seems to be what you'll see most commonly. You won't ever see over 13 in use cases because competitions don't allow it, so no point.
Gotcha, and then if you are somebody who likes something more rigid, obviously you'd err on the side of 13 millimeters. Now, with these two types of levers, you were talking about the nuance between them. Can we quickly go over the difference between your lever and this lever here?
Yep, so what I have here is what most would consider a more traditional lever belt. It's one that you'll see all the time. So for this, you can set it and forget it, meaning you get the same consistent fit over and over again. The problem with that then tends to be some people, number one, if you're traveling or just going through normal weight fluctuations, you then have to adjust the belt because it might be too tight, it might be too loose, or in some cases, some people like to wear their belts in different positions for different lifts, and if you have it at the same thickness or the same tightness, you might not be able to get in those positions that you want to get in.
And even to add a little bit more there, if you're wearing a different type of shirt, like that could even influence it, because I've trained in like a thicker shirt versus a thinner shirt, and lo and behold, now my belt is way too tight.
Yep.
And so that brings in this type of lever, which is an adjustable lever, right?
Yep, so this is an adjustable lever by Pioneer. You also see some adjustable lever belts by people like SBD as well. This one in particular allows you an additional 2.5 inches of movement. So you can kind of go a little bit bigger, a little bit looser if you want. Traditionally, how I use this belt is as I'm warming up, I go tighter and tighter till I get my working fit. Now, the nice thing about this is if I'm traveling or if I want to move the belt into a different position, I still have enough of that playroom to adjust it accordingly. Hopefully I'm not increasing or decreasing my waist by more than 2.5 inches in a day or two, but I still get that consistent on and off like we've already talked about.
And now, speaking of when to use this type of belt, first context is obviously, I think if you are somebody who's getting a lot more specific with their strength work, you're starting to work up to like big 3 RMs, 2 RMs, 1 RMs, you might want to look into one of these types of belts because they are going to be a little bit more rigid. And then in your world of powerlifting, why is this type of belt so important?
Yeah, it's important because obviously when you're powerlifting, especially if you're competing for powerlifting, the goal is to lift as much weight as possible in the squat, bench, and deadlift. And having a belt that gives you more support is going to be more advantageous to you than not wearing a belt whatsoever. Now, the interesting thing about belts that we won't really get into in this video, but maybe we can do a follow-up on, is the actual use case of a belt. We've talked about the goal isn't to be as tight as possible, but to give you something to brace and support against. And there's actually a lot of literature, which most people don't understand, that adding and using a belt does not decrease your core abdominal strength at all. So
Yeah.
little something to kind of throw out there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people too, like they put on a belt, they're like, oh, now I'm just gonna be safe from injuries. And it's like, that's not always the case because there's obviously a lot of torso rigidity that needs to go in there and how you're bracing, and that's a full separate video.
Yeah, I think that's a problem that a lot of people think they'll use a belt because they want to mask or prevent injuries. That's not the case. It's there to add support and rigidity to your core.
And then to talk about why you might not want to grab this belt, I think the first is like obviously the cost of entry. Now, I always say buy once, cry once, especially if you are somebody who is getting more into their lifting career. Your weights aren't going anywhere. You're likely going to keep progressing. So I typically say, like, if you're going to buy a nice belt, you might as well do it because it will last you a while. But outside of that, when else would you not recommend this type of belt?
Yeah, so these type of belts can be tough for people. Now, the ones we have here are 4 inches in width. There are also ones that are 3 inches. So depending on your height, you might want to go with a thinner style belt in the width department, because where you typically wear a belt around your waist between your hips and your rib cage, some people might find that this can dig in more, especially if you go for something like a 13 millimeter level of thickness versus a 10 millimeter. You can then also start looking at other finer details, and I don't want to get too into the rabbit hole here, but sometimes you'll have tapered edges on the side where there's not as rough, versus in this case, they are somewhat tapered so they don't dig in as much. Talk about adding things like suede on to kind of lessen the impact it has on you. But a lot of people find that these belts are extremely uncomfortable and can take some time to break in. Add that to the cost of entry to this, and if you're not a power lifter looking to get the most weight possible out of your lifts, it might not something be for you.
True, and if you are a beginner and you are investing in a lever belt, just expect a couple of weeks of a pretty tough break-in period. We've gone through it, it's not fun. We were talking about this before the video, but we don't typically rotate belts that often throughout training blocks because of that. But do we have anything else to add on lever belts before we dive into prong?
I don't think so. I think we did a good job covering it.
All right, well, let's talk prong belts. So the final belt we're gonna discuss, which arguably should have been in the second spot because it is more popular, I just said it wrong in the video, is the prong belt. So we have two types of prong belts up here. These are gonna be somewhat similar to the lever belt regarding their thickness and construction, but obviously when it comes to a prong belt, the first major construction call out is that it's gonna use a prong system.
Yep, so one of the things I wanna call out first is both of these belts that we're gonna talk about are fairly similar. They have a prong, but they are a single prong. You may have seen some that have a double prong, and maybe in our editing magic, we can throw a picture of what a double prong belt looks like. Please, for the love of God, do not buy one of those belts because it does not add any more stability. And as we'll talk about in just a second, one of the downfalls of having a prong system is getting it on and getting it off. So getting on one of these prongs can be difficult enough. If you have to do it with two, no, prong is wrong.
Yeah, and I have been in a situation where it's like you're getting ready for a nice big like squat set, it's a 1RM, and you have to fuck with both of your prongs, and it's so annoying because then it's like when you're getting ready, if you miss one, then it's all like, just, yeah, I'm with you. Single prong till we die.
So that was a little bit about what was wrong with prongs, but let's talk about what's good with prongs. What is probably, in your opinion, the best reason to go with a prong belt?
So prong belt, I think, is great because it gives you a little bit more adjustability than a lever. And now with the adjustable lever, it's gonna have a much more high price point. With the more like single set and once type of lever, you're gonna be able to obviously have a nice consistent set, but that's not always the most transient for folks who are gonna have a little bit more fluctuation. So I think if you're trying to get into a little bit more of a rigid belt and you want more of an adjustability factor, that's where I think a prong can be really useful. Now, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I agree, because even though I prefer lifting with a lever, as we've talked about before, you have a finite amount of room for adjustment before you have to move the lever. And in order to do so, you gotta break out a screwdriver, or some people actually will carry a small coin in order to undo screws and move it. It tends to be a little bit of a pain. So the benefit of having something like a prong is you have a wide range of holes to choose from, and you can adjust accordingly, and you don't really ever have to change anything on the belt itself.
And then to talk a little bit of nuance really fast with the prong system here, obviously you can see we have a single row of holes here, but then on your belt, there are two sets of holes.
Yep, so this is something that's come around recently. This is, again, called from Pioneer, I should say, but it's an adjustable system here that actually allows for half-inch adjustments. So one of the issues that some people have with a traditional style prong belt, which is 1-inch center on holes, is that getting to the tightest hole setting for them can be fairly difficult, especially if you're dealing with like a 13mm belt. So we've talked about getting them off, but getting them on can also be an issue. You may have seen people bracing against a rack or a pole or having someone pull it for them. That leather is stiff and tight, as we've already mentioned, and getting a single hole in an inch apart can be difficult. So having this half-inch increment makes it a little bit easier, and you can just kind of slide it in.
And then in the context of thickness and sliding it in. So in the context of thickness with these belts, generally you can expect 10 to 13 millimeters. Now there are obviously thinner millimeter thicknesses out there, which we've discussed in the lever belt section. But with these belts, would you say like 10 millimeters is probably like the most standard size?
Yeah, for this, I would actually recommend most people go 10 millimeters. And the reason being is, as I've already said, it can be very tough to break in and get those prongs in the holes that they need to be in. So having a little bit less leather to have to deal with is beneficial here. So going 10 millimeters will make it easier to get to those tighter hole settings.
And then also, just to speak of leather really fast too, when you're looking around, if you are looking into a lever belt, generally, like if you see like the belts from Rogue, the Ohio belt, those are a little bit more maneuverable versus something like from Pioneer that's a little bit more stiff and a little bit more comp focused. So that would be a nuance to consider based off of your preferences if you want a little bit more maneuverability out of the gate. But with prong belts. Are there any other construction features worth mentioning with this style of belt?
I think one thing to call out that unfortunately we don't have an example to show you is probably what most would consider a traditional bodybuilding style belt, which are almost always prong. And that's where you have a thinner lever up top, and then as it gets big in the back, it tapers out and typically has some sort of padding in the back area. What are your thoughts on those belts?
They have context where they make sense, but I think a lot of lifters who are not necessarily experienced bodybuilders tend to put them on and kind of like lean on them a little bit too much throughout their workout. Now, who am I to say if that's right or wrong? There's a lot of context there, and you might be listening to this right now and disagreeing, but I think for most lifters, they're probably not the most functionally useful and likely just kind of a waste of money, and you should just probably go with a different type of belt that's gonna give you a little bit more cross functionality there.
Yeah, I would agree. So obviously in the front, typically because you have a thinner portion up front, you typically don't have as much room to brace against, which we've already talked about several times in this video. As you go to the back, you tend to have too wide of a portion, which would not be able to be used in competition. So if you're looking to get the most out of it, they're not the most ideal. They also tend to be on the thinner and flimsier side. So again, not a lot of support and rigidity there for you to brace against.
And now again, if you are into bodybuilding, that is a whole different world here, and that might make sense for your needs, but again, for most general lifters, it's probably not the most beneficial. Now, when would you not want to use a single prong or a prong belt in general? And like similar to the lever belt, you could probably already guess this, but if you're gonna be doing like a CrossFit or cross training workout where you're gonna be doing a lot of different mixed modality movements, this might be a little bit too rigid for your overall needs. And now price-wise, price of entry, would you say that could also be a deterrent here?
Yeah, so I mean, the pricing of these belts compared to like, let's say a lever belt for the most part, they're gonna be fairly similar. Obviously with these examples we're showing you here, there is a lot of customization done that can add to the total price, but baseline price for either a lever or a prong belt should be somewhat similar. I would say people should stay away from these if you're potentially looking at wearing your belt in the same location for all the lifts, because again, in my experience, a lever belt's gonna make more sense. It's easier to get on and off. You're not gonna have to worry about the adjustability. But where these can really come into play, as you first mentioned at the beginning of this portion, is that you have a lot of versatility in terms of where these fit. So especially if you own a gym or you want to maybe go in on a belt with some people, like you could literally wear this for potentially your entire life without ever having to adjust anything on it because it works like a normal belt is intended.
And now before we wrap this video up, let's just quickly talk on how long you can expect like a really good belt to last, because I've had my Pioneer belt for, I want to say almost 4 or 5 years now, and I had my lever actually break one set on a deadlift, and they were like, we've never even seen that, but they sent me a new one like after 2 days, no questions asked. With a good belt, how long can you expect them to last?
Yeah, so I think the old adage comes into play, buy once, cry once. So oftentimes when you buy some of the higher end belts, while their price point might be more expensive than something you find on Amazon, a lot of times like with Pioneer or with Inzer specifically, the Inzer lever belt is called the Forever belt. And that's because it's literally guaranteed forever. If you ever have an issue with that, or your Pioneer or many of these other higher end belts that you'll see that are released from Best to some of the Titan belts to ones that are escaping my minds right now, like Cardillo belts. I'm sure someone's gonna leave in the comment section below some of the great belts I'm leaving out. SBD, they have the warranty to back them up forever. So you should literally expect to use these for the rest of your life.
All right, Brandon, thank you so much for sharing your weightlifting belt knowledge on us.
You're welcome.
But if you have additional questions on any of these belts, drop a comment down below or reach out to us personally. Obviously, Brandon has some pretty sweet belts with some branding on them. Honestly, I want to try to get one of these belts for myself here.
Yeah, lots of content on these, both on my channel and soon to be on Jake. So if you want more insight, let us know specifically what you want to see. We'll make sure we get that covered.
And all of Brandon's info is dropped down below. But as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop share to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching and stay big.